I keep my cats alive, you know. I think that's I think that's worth something. Um,
Keep
all
yourself
right.
alive. That's pretty important.
Yeah, you just
And
mentioned that. Yeah, keeping myself alive is a pretty good thing. It is
that's
pretty
all we can
nice.
ask. It's just do our best to stay alive, right?
Oh my God. Shall we, well, shall we talk about Saturn? Shall
Shall
we?
we talk about
We can
Saturn?
talk about Saturn. All right. Welcome to Growing with the Stars, where we yap about stars, how to work with them, and the astrology, as well as sometimes going deep dives into history to help you make the most of whatever is coming your way. I am Katie, your resident traditional astrologer and Gemini stellium.
And I'm Kat, and I am here to learn, continue to grow, ask questions on behalf of the audience, take your questions, as well as, work my editing magic in the dark.
Yeah, she also like, brings up some really good history stuff as well, and also like shout out to our Pisces in the room. She helps bring the water and the earth vibes. As I bring the air and the fire, and together we make Captain Planet.
We're really like looking the part today too. Like I gotta say, the backgrounds we both chose, like the makeup going on, the shirt choices, like it's all kind of it's all coming together. The
You
vibe
know,
today is on.
we really were like gonna we really like let's lean into our elements and make it work. Um, Last time we did a big chunk on Saturn through the signs, so check out that episode if you want to hear about Saturn and the signs. Today we're talking about Saturn through the houses, aka what topics Saturn might be showing up in your life. We also have celebrity examples because I can't help myself. And we'll probably also give you some ideas and ways of working with Saturn, depending on what house you're in, just things to reflect on. As always, take what resonates. If something doesn't resonate with you, I'm not offended. Leave me a comment on what works or what doesn't. Maybe we'll do an update.
Do we get to talk about Keanu Reeves again today?
That is a great question. I don't think I have Keanu Reeves
Okay,
today.
he's come up a couple times. I'm always looking forward to it.
I mean, Keanu is great. He is fantastic. Um, but he might be only last time, unfortunately. Um, but we are first going to be talking about Saturn in the first house, which is oftentimes people that I feel like the first house is your sense of self, the identity, the body. And often these folks literally sort of embody Saturn archetypes, whether that's they sort of physically come across as sort of older or mature, or they have a way of representing Saturn and sort of their sense of self. Or they might have a more just like quieter. I often think of elder vibes. There's definitely some debate in the astrology community if Saturn is daddy or mommy in the sense of is Saturn a masculine or feminine planet? I tend to see him as granddaddy personally, but that's me. But I think a really good example for this is actually Morgan Freeman. Because this man, like, I feel like he's the entire time I have known of him, he's been like the man, the God voice. You know what I mean? Like, he's got that slow, deep voice. So this is Morgan Freeman's chart. And I think the thing I really want to focus on is like that Saturn. He's Aries rising, Saturn in Aries, Sun in Gemini, and yeah, I was like, wow. I was like looking at it. I was like, Moon in Gemini. I was like, no, that is the Moon in Aquarius. And I think it's just interesting because he really wanted to be like a pilot, like an air. I believe he wanted to be like a fighter pilot when he was younger. Oh, that is not what I wanted to do. Um, but he there were some issues and he didn't end up doing that, right? And so one of the things we sometimes see with Saturn is limitations and hindrances. But he has made, right, this really career, he's been really well known, Saturn in the first, ruling the 10th house for as being sort of an elder, particularly later in his Hollywood career. and sort of representing in some ways Saturn in some very like positive ways for him. So just because you're a night chart doesn't always mean that your Saturn is always going to be a challenge for all things in life. It just might be a challenge, particularly when you're younger. Um, and so for folks with Saturn in Aries, I always wanted you to kind of think about what are the limitations of your body, right? Unfortunately, limitations, restriction, sometimes issues with skin or bone show up here because those are things Saturn rules. Understanding the limitations of your body, and also how do you find yourself working with and embodying wisdom, age, and time, are all sort of very interesting things.
For Saturn and Aries or Saturn in the first, you mean?
Just Saturn in the first, great question.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, technically the first house is Aries, right? So like how does that like,
So you're
yeah.
bringing up the ABC method, which is like when people conflate the first house with specific zodiac signs. I don't think that's a super useful technique. There's a few cases where that works, and that's mostly in health and medical astrology, which I don't really practice. But in this case, what I would say is like it's actually going to confuse you more to try to conflate, oh, Aries as always equals the first house, because it just is going to merge topics together rather than help you understand and master each one.
Okay, yeah. I actually had never thought about the two, but when you said Saturn and Aries and then I was like, oh, you mean like the first, but that is the first and then that okay. So I think I wonder
Yeah,
if you
for
just meant
Morgan Freeman, it is his first house. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Okay, okay. But
No,
actually
no, I think it's a
I
great
think actually
question.
that I think that rotation that's interesting. It's funny I've never thought about people doing that actually, merging the two together. They're so separate for me because like if I don't think about them separately, yeah, my brain will implode.
Yeah, it's a teaching technique that some folks have used. It got really popular for a minute. I think a lot of astrologers today are like, "Hey, I find it conflating things together in a way that can make it harder to really understand what you're talking about." I think one other thing I just want to mention with Morgan Freeman, is more of like having Saturn in a night chart, particularly sometimes finding finding something through difficulty. And so he had Saturn in Aries ruling the 10th. I can bring up the chart again, so we can see it. And I think it's really interesting that so he's a night chart. See, the sun is down here, down in Gemini. And I think it's very interesting that he starts acting as a punishment for picking on somebody in school. It was like, oh, you did this thing, so now you need to spend time after school being part of this play. And I think it's really interesting that it's like through challenge and through difficulty, he actually finds something that he really likes. And so sometimes Saturn can have that, which is that like through challenges, major opportunities kind of lock for you. Which is not like that sort of is the malefic, the difficult side of Saturn. This actually also shows up with the Saturn in the second house example that we'll talk about, but we'll get there. Saturn in the second house is all about, there's often restrictions, issues around money, possession, finances, or resources, right? The things that we have that like help us live and survive. And I want to bring up Danny Trejo, who is a famous actor in his own right now. But growing up, he was a criminal. And like in 1968, he almost got the death penalty. But he actually started acting and doing rough vigilante parts. And I think it's really striking when we start to see his chart. So this is his chart. We once again have a night chart. So he is a Taurus rising, the sun in Taurus, and the moon is in Pisces. And we can see the Saturn in Gemini in the second house. And so that's where we see sort of money, possessions, finances showing up as a problem, right? Showing up as a difficulty. Once again, he's another very interesting character where his 10th house and his midheaven are both going to be ruled by Saturn. So once again, he like finds his visibility, his career through the difficult. And he starts as an actor playing a lot of these sort of like tough guy Latino parts.
Yeah, I think they said that he said that they wanted him because of his tattoo, because he had the big tattoo on his chest, and so they always wanted him to take his shirt off, which is so funny. My aunt
Right?
has the biggest crush on him. She
That's so
has
funny.
they had a thing at work, and they had a cardboard cutout of Danny Trejo that came to promote the thing, and they let her take it home, and so she has it at home hanging on her wall because she has the hugest crush on him, and she always comes home, she's like, "Hi, Danny. Oh, Danny, don't look at me like that."
That is hilarious. And I really think it brings up like his Venus on the ascendant. So when you're a night chart, Venus is typically the most benefic or most helpful planet, and he has a very, very strong Venus in its own sign, in a night chart. So his physicality, right, his physical presence, his body becomes something that is desired and wanted, even though it's through the sort of like less traditional like means, right? So the tattoo and sort of looking like an outsider. I would say Taurus is a very embodied, very physical sign, and it is a lot of like the benefit and how to work with, right, that Mars, not that Mars, that Saturn and Gemini is, the resources through the sense of self, it's through the body, it's through sort of what you embody. And he found a way to do that in a way that was maybe a little less traditional, and using that experience not as something to run from, but to help him get out in a sense.
Yeah, almost like in really reckoning with the things he's been through and being open about them, and like having seeming to have at least processed them and stuff, he was able to kind of flip that in his favor, I guess, not favor
Yeah.
necessarily, I don't know, but like, and kind of work with his placement without maybe even really realizing it.
Yes, a lot of folks, whether or not you realize it, are probably doing things that help embody and express it effectively. And when you do that, that's often when we see some of the most success is folks finding ways to work with their charts, even if they don't know that they're doing that. And so if you have Saturn in the second, there's a couple things, which is like, you know, minimalism sometimes or being restrictive around your possessions can be something that you sometimes value. And then there's also sort of the like, hey, when are you being too extreme with that? When is the difference between being simple and, you know, I think of it sometimes as in the like, you are so cost conscious, you only ever, let's just say you only ever buy the cheapest shoes and the cheap shoes break every 3 weeks versus if you can, waiting, a little bit longer to buy a nicer pair of shoes that are going to last you a year, right?
Okay, but it's so funny you mentioned shoes, because my friend and I had a whole conversation last night talking about how a $50 pair of shoes right now might as well be a $15 pair of shoes at this point. And like
Yeah.
the quality. And I was talking to my mom, I was like, Mom, this morning, because we also got into talking about clothes, and we were like, the fabric is just, it's falling apart. It's just falling apart. It's falling apart. They're all falling apart. You can't find a
Yeah,
sturdy pair of
most
shoes, man.
fashion now, as a tangent, yes, has become incredibly, excuse me, most fashion now is done in a very cheap, disposable way, and you are often better, unfortunately, if you can, buying vintage or like buying things that are repairable. Like one of the things I'm looking into is like boots that are resolable because like those are like $300 up front and then you resole them every like couple of years versus like the $70 pair of sneakers that you have to keep buying over and over again, which sucks. But it is a very Saturn thing, which is like the better way to lean into a Saturn in the second is okay, what are your things that you have that can endure, that can last, that can be maintained is a healthier way of sort of leaning into that. So The next one is Saturn in the third house. And Saturn here is often things around delays or difficulty, sometimes with education or language, right? The third house is also a place of siblings. And so we sometimes see folks that are very like close, maybe with their grandparents or hanging out with older people, or like spending a lot of time in sort of third spaces with older folks, because Saturn often represents the elder, or unhoused folks can often come up here. And the like we also, I mean, sometimes it can be very literal in the sense of language issues. And the unfortunate example I have is Bruce. This is not the right chart. Let me find Bruce Willis again. So this is his chart. And what we're going to see here is that he is a Virgo rising, Pisces sun, Aquarius moon, and he has Saturn in the third in a night chart. And if you don't know, Bruce Willis, right, has stepped back from acting because he has an illness that is slowly taking away his ability to speak. It's frontotemporal dementia, a rare and progressive neurological condition that affects the front and temporal lobes, which really, I mean, one of its main things is it impacts language and ability to speak. And right, a major part of acting is an ability to recite lines. And so, unfortunately, sometimes we see like there is a restriction or a limitation or hindering around communication. And for some folks, this shows up as delays in childhood. This can also show up later in life as a health issue. Um, Once again, if you have Saturn in the third and a night chart, that doesn't mean that that's exactly what's going to happen to you, but that is like one way it's manifesting in Bruce Willis's life. I think like another childhood example. Well, this one's a little different. We'll not put it up. But yeah, sometimes you see things like the other way that sometimes it shows up is like Saturn, Mercury conjunction or co-presence. James Earl Jones had that, and he actually like refused to speak for like years as a
Mhm.
kid. So there's lots of ways it can show up. There's definitely more positive ways we see Saturn in the third. And so this is Jodie Foster. So she's a Sagittarius rising, Pisces, Jupiter, Sun in Scorpio, Moon in Virgo. So she's a day chart. Um, I think it's really interesting that her name is technically like when she wasn't born as a Jody, her siblings actually named her, like that was her nickname, and that's what stuck, which I think is kind of funny because she's actually Alicia Christian, quote unquote, Jodie Foster. So she is known and remembered by something that her siblings named her, sort of the like, that is where sort of Saturn is showing up as sort of the sort of what is the thing that endures. And the third house is often siblings, or we also see grandparents show up here, um, just as a thing. But she, was fine in school. The other place where this shows up is that she doesn't have a real relationship with her father. So there's some like half siblings and some potential, I think, things with there. So it definitely shows up in a various ways. And so Saturn in the third can be a bit of a hodgepodge. I mean, Saturn is in Aquarius, one of its home signs. It's very strong. I have seen mixed things with this, but I often see a malefic that is so close to the south node like hers is, can also give a much more mild version of Saturn. And so I think that might also be part of the story, which is like, yeah, there's some like weird things going on with the family a little bit, like not super close with dad, original dad, but that kind of is like tempered by the really beautiful Jupiter and Pisces. So there's like things are all kind of working out. So if you have Saturn in the third, I think like one of the things you can kind of look at is like what's your relationship with like education, like growing up, or like speaking, or like your voice. what does it mean to have or not have relationships with your siblings, with your neighbors, your grandparents, the elders? And, because sometimes Saturn shows up as like, yeah, this is a challenge, or yeah, there's like a separation here. Or it's that you connect more deeply with your local environment in other ways. For instance, sometimes a classic Saturn in the third house would be somebody that like that like does like deals with wild cats in the area, like does like trap, neuter, and release of feral cat colonies. Saturn, the Saturn animal, if you need one, is a cat. And so, somebody that has Saturn in the third might be very much into like cat rehabilitation, cat rescues in their local area as well.
My friend who has Saturn in the third volunteers every week with a cat rescue.
What can I say? I'm really good at my job. Really good at my job. I say this also as somebody that has Saturn. We'll talk about Saturn in the sixth, but I have Saturn and Capricorn in the sixth house. And yes, I do have two cats. Sometimes one of them shows up on this. Both of them are leading a very rough life now, napping in my house. The poor, poor things.
They have such a hard life.
They have the worst, and I feel incredibly bad for them. Okay. We're chugging along, and we're now getting into Saturn in the fourth house, right? So this is going to be something around home, your lineage, your cultural lineage. Sometimes it can be like grandparents or people that stayed with you, or a very strong like authority, like oftentimes like a father figure at home, those sorts of things. And we're going to talk about Billy Crystal first. So if you don't know, Billy Crystal, really famous, funny comedian. And I think he's got a very interesting chart because our dude is a Taurus rising, Pisces sun, Taurus moon. He's a day chart. So Saturn's not his most difficult planet per se. But what's interesting is Saturn rules his 10th house and his midheaven degree in Capricorn. And he has Saturn in Leo in the fourth, right? So already there's going to be some sort of tie-in with family and his public life. His family's actually in the entertainment industry. There's a whole record thing called Commodore Records, was founded by his uncle. His dad was a promoter. It didn't last, but it was certainly a major piece of the life. And I think it's really interesting that like it was during his Saturn opposition when Saturn, I think in like 1963, that like his dad also passed, right? So there's like a major piece around family in the entertainment industry that like is tied in for him. And some of it was certainly not super easy. The other chart I want us to take a look at is Penelope Cruz, very famous Spanish actress. She's an Aries rising, Taurus sun, Cancer moon. I think it's very interesting that she has Saturn in the fourth, also ruling her midheaven as well as her 10th house, a lot like Billy Crystal. But she's also really known for being a foreigner, right? So part of the midheaven, part of our 10th house is how we're seen. And she's known for being Spanish, right? She's known for having an accent. She's known for like playing these particular roles. I think it's also interesting that she spent a lot of time at her grandparents' house. And so like that's also sort of tied in with it. It's not that she had a particularly, at least publicly difficult childhood, but is certainly sort of how she is known for sort of being away or from being from a separate place. And so if you happen to be like Billy Crystal or Penelope Cruz, there's always the question is like, what's your relationship to tradition, to stability, to cultural lineage? I think that's going to be a big piece for these folks. And what is your relationship to home, to birthplace? How has that changed over time? And even maybe what's your relationship to family family authority figures, your dad or particularly grandparents? Like how has that maybe changed over time? What is so funny?
I'm just thinking about my friend. It's fine.
Just your cat rescue friend?
It's just so crazy. I feel like every like placement you've described like in the houses and stuff like that just feels very like Saturn just seems to make itself known in a person. Like it just seems
Yeah.
very like, yeah.
Saturn typically, I mean, because Saturn moves so slowly, I think he tends to be much louder and long term for that reason. You know, he's a pretty intense planet. Um, for better or worse, whether we want him to be or not.
Honestly,
Right?
have
He's a
no
really,
opinion. He's not really doing me dirty or anything like that that I can tell for the most part. He's just trying to lay some foundations, in my opinion, that
yeah, I mean
are,
that's good.
you know,
Usually you'll notice if he's like in a hard angle or like conjunct a particular planet in your chart, or like you're in a square or an opposition. So let's say you have Saturn in a cardinal sign, that anytime Saturn is in one of the other cardinal signs, it might be more noticeable for you. There's stuff like that. Um, I'm trying not to think about the fact that Saturn's going to station retrograde and create a cardinal T square in my chart in July. So we're just not going to think about that right now. Okay. Thank you.
I believe in you. I believe in you.
I appreciate it.
Even if you didn't know it was going to happen, you'd still live through it. That's
That's a
that's
good
the
way to look
fact.
at it. That's a good way to look at it. Saturn in the fifth, he's dealing with things around fertility, pleasure, creativity. I often see a lot of like, sometimes people have fertility issues or delays, or there's more it can be difficulty around conception. Not always, but it could be like you don't want children, or your relationship to pleasure is going to look very different than other people's. And the example I really love for this is actually Ian McKellen. Um, and I found a bunch of Saturn in Aries today, which was not my intent, but it's just what's in the zeitgeist, I guess. Now,
It's in the
Ian
air.
McKellen, yeah, he actually came out right as gay at a time when that was pretty outside the norm. Like I believe he was pretty much, I don't remember the exact dates that he was out, but he was kind of out to people that knew him in like the 60s and 70s, right? Um and that wasn't always done, right? So and sometimes in certain traditional texts, we do see Saturn has a lot to do with being an outsider. And so Saturn in the fifth can show an outsider of its time frame sexuality. And granted, being LGBTQ in this day and age is not always as easy as it should be, no matter where we're at. And so I'm not saying like a specific placement is going to always mean you have this sexuality or not. It happens to show up very on point in this way for Ian McKellen. Um,
1988, which would have been a really rough time to come out, actually.
yes. Oh, thank you. Yeah, because that's also during the AIDS epidemic, the real crisis point where, particularly being seen as LGBTQ at that time frame was like you had this disease that was like God's punishment for you, which is ultimately such bullshit. Let's put that out there. But yes, it has, he grew up and embodied his sexuality in a time frame when that was certainly not easy. And he's been very loud and proud about it for a long time since then. There's I think a lot of reasons we see Saturn as sort of outsider sexuality, because unfortunately these folks have been seen as outsiders for far too long. Um, as far as like a lot around like fertility and like and delays, I think a really good example is actually Sigourney Weaver or Sigourney. I don't know how you say it. This is one of those where I'm like, is that how you say her name? Incredible actress,
Sigourney?
Sigourney. Yeah, she's an alien, um, very
Yeah,
very famous
amazing.
actress.
Amazing.
Um, super interesting because she is Taurus rising. Look at that gorgeous exalted moon, the sun in Libra, um, the moon in Taurus. And she has a night chart and she does have Saturn, one of the most traditionally challenging planets, in the fifth, right? And she talks about becoming a mother later in life. Um, and she sort of delayed it partially due to her acting career. And also, like, I think there were some issues conceiving, but like there was a lot of just like, how do I prioritize caring for my kids as well as my career? Because like that just is a really difficult thing, I think, as a woman in Hollywood and sort of the way acting works in that world. Um, so it's not always that you will not have children if you want children, but sometimes it can say, hey, it might not be as easy or on the time frame that you're going to want them to be happening in. Saturn highlights things that are going to take longer and are much slower to often get to fruition. Some questions to think about if you have Saturn in the fifth house, which is how does extra time or how is slowing down something that is like something that can be helpful, whether it comes to your creativity, to your pleasure, to enjoying things, right? Maybe it's that you really love cooking and you don't really want to rush it. Your idea of enjoying cooking is actually like a multi-hour process. That would be a very Saturn in the fifth way of cooking. Um, and it might also be like, hey, like, is your way of doing like fun and games a little outside of the norm? Or like, do you want to bring in, is there traditions or legacies that you want to bring into how you do creativity? For some folks, that might be re-engaging with a cultural lineage and sort of like doing a traditional kind of dance, right? Or for some folks, it's like, I am upending the way my team does kickball, and that's outsider way of doing it. It's really fun for me. We're getting into Saturn in the sixth, which is often about, I find a lot of health, like routine health comes up here, habits, things that were in service or in subordinates comes up here, pets. And I also think of our like day-to-day work, like the kind of the day job that pays the bills is a very Saturn and sixth thing. And Saturn here is like, okay, the impact of your daily rituals, your day-to-day work, your day-to-day practices really matters. And like your health can often really matter here. I know this is a Saturn in the sixth house girly. What up? What up? Lived experience. Um, and so I think two people had really interesting kind of Saturn in the sixth experiences. And so first is Bruce Lee. He's Sagittarius rising, Sagittarius sun, Scorpio moon. I mean, goddamn, very intense Scorpio stellium, which is really fascinating. But the thing that's so interesting to me is that sort of Jupiter, Saturn, um, they're nearly conjunct. They're about 2 degrees apart in his chart, but they're both in the sixth house of Taurus. And right, he's known for his physicality and the physical work that he did, right? And like his martial arts. And so there's both the personal focus and the personal drive, but also how he makes money and like, right. And he made money off of like martial arts and martial arts training before he becomes this movie star that is also doing martial arts stuff. Martial arts, commitment, the dedication, how he makes his money is certainly all tied into his physical work and his daily habits and practices that like ultimately helped him become famous. Let me pull up the other person I want to focus on. We've got another Saturn in Aries, and this is Betty Davis. Scorpio rising, Aries sun, Gemini moon. Um, I think it's interesting that like her childhood was rough, right? And we see Saturn in the sixth, interestingly ruling her fourth house of home and family, but it also rules right the third of education. And she was sent away for school. She was basically I don't know that her parents could really afford to have her around. It was that kind of boarding school, not like a richy rich boarding school. And work was always a focus for her that became an issue in her private life and some of her relationships, because she would prioritize work over her partners. That might be a little bit less of Saturn and might be more of having Mars in the seventh house. Um, we could argue about that all day, but basically, she had a lot of focus and a lot of drive, which was not always like what people wanted women to prioritize in that era. Um, but you sort of see the sort of the focus, the dedication on what she really cared about over maybe what other people expected her to do. That sort of traditional, what a traditional Saturn, if she had maybe Saturn in Capricorn or Saturn in Taurus, but her Saturn is in Aries, and she wasn't going to do what other people expected her to do. So if you have Saturn in the sixth, like myself, um, when I think there's a really important thing of like, I find that these folks often really love structure and they often really have like practices. And it sort of is like, hey, if you're so focused on your rituals, when are you losing the bigger picture? Right. Sometimes um, I will want to say no to doing certain things with friends because I'm like, well, I always have this thing that I do at that time. And I'd be like, I haven't seen this person in a month. I can skip going to this thing once in a while to go and see a person, right? So like that's like it sounds very silly, but that's like truly a Saturn in the sixth. Um, I also think it's like, hey, how is your day-to-day habits impacting your health? This showed up for me in my Saturn return, where like the way I was sitting in my office environment was like so bad for my neck and the strain on my system that I was getting like nerve pain and I had to like change. That's how I got into weightlifting actually was because I had to like strengthen my back to stop having like essentially like nerve sensation down into my arms. So those are some of those things. And also like, you know, how do your daily rituals, practices, how does that reflect your values or not? And do they show up? Are they the things that you want to endure? Saturn loves things that can endure. If it can't endure, maybe don't set yourself up to fail, right? It's not good to try to like run a marathon the first time you go running. It's not going to go well. Also, spend time with cats. Saturn in the sixth, you were meant to spend time with cats. That's less serious, but I think it's true.
Yeah, I think you should just spend time with cats anyway. So, they're
Amen.
great. They're great little guys.
They are. Talk about creatures that know boundaries. They are the rulers of all boundaries. Um, oh my God. I'm really excited about the example I have for the Saturn in the seventh because it's kind of wild. We might have talked about it last time, but Saturn in the seventh is all about relationships or commitment, right? Whether it's somebody that you're married, like romantic relationships, work partnerships, and often we want them to endure and bind and sort of withstand time. Saturn in the seventh can also be delays in marriage and partnerships. Did we talk about Kenneth Branagh last time? Um, his shit is crazy
I,
though.
for the life of me, cannot remember, but I mean, listen, people are iconic for a reason.
Oh my God. So Kenneth Branagh is known for doing these Shakespeare adaptations. He's very well known for it. I love As Much Ado About Nothing. It's very hot. He also happened to have the woman who I think was they were at the time married was him and Emma Thompson. They were sort of like the British actor it couple. They get married when Saturn is in Capricorn. Basically like I think it's like 1989, 1990. I like looked at I don't have the date in front of me. They get married at his Saturn return, which is very on brand if you have Saturn in the seventh, right? For commitment. Now, that commitment gets messy because what's very interesting, right? And so it's well known that he has an affair during when he does Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And oh my God, I should know her name now because
Helena Bonham Carter.
yes,
Hmm.
they have an affair. Now, this was like in the mid 90s when Uranus and Neptune were on his natal Saturn. And Saturn had was transiting by that point. Share my
And when
screen.
having an affair was still scandalous.
Yeah. By then, Saturn, I believe, was in Aquarius, yeah, on his midheaven. So he's having this Uranus and Neptune on Saturn, right? Is going to be dissolving, innovating, breaking free of a commitment. But he's doing it in a very public way. It's not going to be good for his reputation because once again, he's a night chart. And so there is the falling, the depression of his public reputation. I like saw the chart for the transits for when they started the Frankenstein production. I was like gobsmacked, gobsmacked at how on brand it was for like an affair or a bad collaboration that was going to really harm his reputation. Um, so yeah, he and Emma Thompson have a very public divorce. I believe he remarries at some point, but actually, ironically, Helena Bonham Carter, I think, leaves him for Tim Burton. Um, and they were also having an affair. Like Hollywood can be messy.
Life is just messy, honestly.
Truly, truly. But I think when it comes to Saturn in the seventh, it's like, okay, what is commitment to you? Why is it commitment that is so important? And what are your non-negotiables? Right? Sometimes Saturn can be a little picky, right? And that's okay. It's easier to say no than to say yes with Saturn. I think it's also the question of like sometimes we care more about the commitment than being happy. And so I think one thing to also think about is not just what should this endure, but when is it okay to let go, to say that something isn't working or isn't working and you need to move on. You need to let go of a thing. Um, just some easy, light topics to deal with.
Saturn is, as ever, lighthearted and, you know,
There's a reason jovial comes from the word Jove, and not AKA the one of the names for Jupiter in the Roman world, and not Saturn. God
I was gonna
bless
say
Time
it,
Daddy.
it definitely seems like Jupiter, it'd be harder to turn down a lot of the stuff that Jupiter was offering, even though it maybe isn't always super beneficial for you.
Right? Right? Yeah. Um, we're gonna get on to more serious topics, which is Saturn in the eighth, which is a tricky area. The eighth house, there's both like shared resources, things around finances, assets, debts, but it also can be a lot about like taboo in the sense of, what was I thinking of? Like life and death issues, hidden or unspoken things. There's a lot of like dealing with that, unfortunately. And um I think an example that we're going to be seeing, we'll talk about Renee Zellweger first, because I think her Saturn experience is a little bit more easier to see in a way because it's kind of already happened. So she's a Virgo rising, the sun in Taurus, Saturn in Aries. And the thing that's really interesting is that um, her father lost his job, I think around her junior or senior year in high school. And so she no longer had money to go to college. And it's interesting, is this was probably as Saturn was entering Sagittarius, her fourth house. And so one Saturn experience, right, is something to do with her dad, like a limitation, and it comes up and shows up in an assets like other people's money, the eighth, impacting her personally. And, sets her off on a career that instead of, going into college and something else, she like goes into acting. And so that's one way Saturn can show up with sort of some of these financial difficulties, sometimes through no fault of your own, but like other people in your life. Now, the messier one is Ewan McGregor. This is his chart. Our man is a Libra rising. Um, where is that sun? Hello, sun. Come here, little sun. Aries. He's a Libra rising, Aries sun, Gemini moon, and he does have Saturn in the eighth in Taurus. And he's openly acknowledged alcoholism as a previous issue, something that he's dealing with. But he also had a recent affair with a co-star on Fargo, and now is having a very, very expensive divorce because he has been married for a very long time. And I think it was far before he was a rich and famous actor. So I do not think there is a prenup. So something to be watching, which I think is very interesting, is how that's going to play out for him.
You know, I don't keep up too much with the current events, so that to me is tea. And so I'm like, oh wait, do tell, excuse me? Like what?
Yeah. It basically I don't remember exactly how it came out and was well known, but I think somebody caught him and his co-star like out on a date. And that said that's kind of part of that. So yeah, um he married a woman, Eva Mavrakis, I believe is her last name, and they've been married. They met on, so they had four daughters. Um, Apparently, they're saying this now, but basically they claim that they've been separated since 2017. They filed for, and on January 19th, 2018, he filed for divorce, and the divorce was finalized apparently in 2020. But he began a relationship in May of 2017, which is conveniently right when they separated, per Wikipedia. Um, so I don't, that feels a little bit too convenient for me, but the divorce is finalized, and I don't know how much it was, but I don't expect it to have been cheap. Um, so, sometimes Saturn in the eighth, it's like, first off, what is your relationship to finances? How does that show up in partnerships? And like, what is control around that? Sometimes it can be a little bit domineering and sort of restrictive, um, which isn't always super healthy. Um, I also think, understanding how is rest and how do you need to rest, give yourself space for that, and to handle sort of life and its difficulty. Um, the eighth house is often a place of idleness. And so I think giving yourself time and space to handle and look at the darkness can make it easier to handle the weight of the responsibility of these topics.
Don't give up. It's just the weight of the world.
Just the weight of the world. Oh my God. Um, the next one I think is a lot. I think the next, I love Saturn in the ninth. I think it's really fascinating how it shows up. And it's very, very interesting because you get so many things here. We've got like foreignness, we get worldviews, there's legal things, exile shows up here. Um, and weirdly, like there's some weird ways this works. And I want to start with Peter
Now,
Jackson,
you say exile, but you don't mean Saturn in exile. You mean exile in terms of
like living abroad, like
living abroad. Okay.
emigration.
Just
Yeah.
want to clarify.
Great question. Yes. Unfortunately, one of the ways I do talk about detriment is exile, which I think is a better way of saying detriment, but that's another story. This is Peter Jackson. He's the director who's well known for like The Lord of the Rings and basically creating a massive, like, I think, tourism industry around people visiting New Zealand. Um, Taurus rising, Scorpio, Sun, Leo, Moon. He's got a very well dignified Saturn in the ninth, ruling the 10th. Um, he's like, he's known for films set in New Zealand, which I think kind of is part of this sort of foreignness, otherness. He's also uh, he's a traditional aviation collector. He owns an aircraft restoration and manufacturing company, which is very like ninth house Saturn ruling the 10th. Like airplanes, which is a form of long distance travel, is very, very ninth house.
Yeah, I just didn't, I just, and that I never had heard of that. And so, like, that's just kind of like, unexpected, but very cool. Very
Yeah,
cool.
like sometimes it's like, I mean, it's a very positive way. Granted, he's also a day chart. The sun is just above the horizon. So it's going to be a much more positive Saturn experience. It also helps that Jupiter is there with it, um, being very, very lovely. He does have a sextile to Mars, but like there's a lot of very supportive angles to his Saturn, which gives it a really, really like much more tempered experience. Not perfect, but tempered. A much, much darker story, unfortunately, is Tina Turner. Um, Now, you, unfortunately, she passed in the past year. She's a Leo rising, Sagittarius, Sun, Gemini, Moon. Saturn is going to be her most difficult planet, and it rules her seventh house of relationships. Um, if you do not know, she had a very, very public legal case trying to divorce Ike Turner, who was abusive. Um, they've done like there's incredible movies. She has a biography. It's very hard to read, but certainly something to take a look at. Interestingly, she basically all she wanted to take out was she all she wanted to be able to leave was with her name, and it like basically destroyed her financially for a while. Um, However, right, she has a much more positive experience with it later in life. She actually moves to Switzerland. She actually renounces her US citizenship and becomes a Swiss citizen later in life. So, Saturn is her most difficult planet, shows up, right? It shows up right around ninth house topics, legal issues, as well as what it rules in her chart, which is the seventh, right? Partnerships, and a little bit also about her work, because like so much of it was that she and Ike Turner were like a very well-known musical duo. But joke's on Ike because he sucks. And Tina Turner, very much her work and legacy outlived him. So fuck you, Ike. I,
Big time. No, big time. Like just abusers in general, man.
yeah, I don't personal experience, but I've known others who have. I do not suffer this lightly. Let's put it that way. I'm just trying to not breathe on the mic so it's not like a wind gust on my microphone. You're muted, I think.
Oh, I said just blowing the mic like
But if you have Saturn in the ninth, how does responsibility, age, wisdom, how does that affect your worldview? How does tradition show up or not? Right? What do you have what is the relationship between, religion, travel, or higher education? Does that feel very heavy? Does it feel like a big responsibility to you? Um, Sometimes it can just be like Saturn in the ninth is like you're kind of a homebody. It feels too onerous to like want to go places, or you just don't feel like higher education's a good fit for you, or it's just a lot of work. And that's okay. And so, and for some folks, it's just something that like you maybe only want to explore these topics when you're older. Also okay and very on brand for Saturn. It gets easier with time, typically.
seems like it really works out for a lot of people to like actually get away from their tradition or like their home,
It
quote
very much
unquote.
depends, I think, on the sign, right? Like I think a Saturn and Capricorn in the ninth is going to be much more likely to have higher, like basically return to kind of a kind of cultural homeland versus an Saturn in Aries, which is just to leave and be a foreigner in a foreign place. We got Saturn in the 10th. We're in the last, I was like, there's only three more. I was like, the last four. And I was like, there's no 14 houses, Katie. Dear God.
Oh no, don't. This is the prediction coming in is that they're going to add two more, which means they're going to have to take what, 5 degrees off of every house or two
Oh
and a half
God, no,
degrees off of every house.
we're not doing this Ophiuchus shit. Oh God.
Wait,
No.
wait. Is there 14 houses?
No, people try to like make up a 13th zodiac sign, and it's just like it's just there's a lot of reasons that just doesn't work, right? You're dealing with the ecliptic and like anyways, like this the astrology in some ways is like an idealized theoretical system, no matter if you're using tropical or sidereal, because you're taking constellations that are not of even sizes and creating like idealized 30-degree sections, unless you're doing like actual sky astrology, which is like basically all Virgo with like tiny slices of everything else. Virgo is actually a very large constellation. I just every year you get that thing where it's like your sun sign's not really your sun sign, which is like people talking about the
Oh
precession of
no.
the stars. And then you also have somebody that's like, there's actually 13 constellations. And I'm like, shut up. Like you are literally do 3 seconds of research before you talk to me. Just 3 seconds about this topic.
Also, it's not like something new would change something old with so much foundation.
Well, it's this like
Like you
kind
would
of
build
gotcha moment.
something adjacent. It wouldn't be like,
Well, it's also these people that are like, look at these astrologers. They're so stupid. And I'm like, you think that we don't know about the precession of the stars? You don't think that astrologers discussed this, have rationalized like it's so insulting because it shows you have no real desire to even engage with the tradition. You just want people to be wrong. And I'm like, it's fine to like be like, oh, why is it that you don't do this? Why like it would be very different if somebody asked a question of like, oh, why isn't a ficus part of that group? Versus saying, well, you should have it this way. And I'm like, okay, have you read Ptolemy? Have you read any of these other? And they're like, what? And I'm like, if you don't know why people, like, if you don't know that we've discussed this for over 2000 years and people made conscientious decisions, why should I talk to you about this? I'm not debating you. I don't have time for this shit.
the the P in Chat GPT stands for Ptolemy, apparently, right?
My God. He'd probably want to kick someone's ass for that, but I think that's hilarious. Um, anyway, um, we're going to talk about Saturn in the 10th. I often find for these folks, they're often people that have Saturn as part of their reputation. So what does that mean? It can be something that is old, like they can be sort of associated with wisdom, with grouchiness. They can be associated with land and laborers, or it's somebody that's associated with outsiders and the marginalized, right? We're talking about these sort of figures that are often seen as like less than stellar. And I think this is very interesting because I want to talk about Julia Roberts. Not somebody that you think of as an outsider, but let's show her screen. She's actually starting her second Saturn return. She's a Cancer rising, Scorpio sun, Saturn in Aries. This is somebody that you think would have honestly struggles with their public life and reputation. That exalted Mars is doing a lot of work for her, so good on that Mars. Um, but think about one of her major first roles was Pretty Woman, right? The movie, is well-known romance about a sex worker having a relationship with a wealthy man and them falling in love. Seems like an outsider, marginalized person, if you know what I mean. You know? And so I think it's very interesting that she is sort of known for this character. Um,
Well,
I
that and
also
Aaron
think
Brockovich, right?
Aaron Brockovich as well, yeah, where she
Yeah.
plays sort of like an outsider paralegal that becomes critical in a class action legal case for a whole town, right?
Yeah, like one of the famous scenes is like them being like, "Oh, you don't know enough about this case to like be working on it." And she's like, "Oh, give me a name and I'll give you their phone number or something like that." And they're like, "There's this many people in the case, right?" And then,
Hmm.
you know, that's like the whole thing. And like, yeah, it's based on that, but the scene is played a certain way and like her being that outside character coming in and being like, here's the number. You want to give me another one? Here's all their diagnoses. Here's this, and this, and like showing that she's actually fully qualified to be there and, do the job.
Yeah, yeah. Another fantastic example. I also think it's just interesting because Saturn rules her seventh, and she's had some messiness in her marriage in that She met her husband on set. I think he's a cinematographer. It's unclear if there was an affair or not. But she, during the divorce, she had a shirt made that was clearly talking a little bit of smack. Let me see if I can find. I think this is the image.
Every time someone says
Um,
cinematographer, I can only hear cinematographer, and I don't remember what it's from, but it's like the echolalia that's in my head every single time.
oh my God. Yeah. So they met on the filming of The Mexican, um, which was 2000. And whether or not she's a homewrecker, I don't really care, but she basically wore this shirt at one point during the divorce, was like clearly willing to get photographed. Um, and sometimes I think that's one of the things that we can sometimes see with like a fallen planet like Saturn, is you're going to see more extreme versions of it. It's going to get a little spicy. Um, actually, when was this photo taken? So this is actually, let's just for shits and giggles, I want to see what the transits were on March 22nd, 2002. Um, this is the life of a astrologer is we're going back in time. We're going to Hollywood. We're going to say unknown time because I don't want to deal with that. Oh, so we've got Venus on her midheaven, highlighting her being visible, being seen. Saturn in her 12th house. Messy, messy, messy. What was Mercury doing? And Mercury was in Pisces, struggling in the ninth. Uh, I'm not saying that this is on brand, but I do think it's very interesting to see how messy all of this is going down. Particularly like a Jupiter moon conjunction that day when she was born around a Jupiter moon conjunction, um, probably was a little bit of a expanding her worst tendencies, emotionally speaking.
Just a little bit of that Saturn seasoning to spice things up. It's fine.
Yeah, yeah, totally okay. Yeah, and it's interesting because it's a Saturn. Saturn's a sextile right now in those two. So, um, the desire to be a little messy can show up. Final questions. If you have Saturn in the 10th, are you okay with your work, your legacy taking time to build? And I think the other thing is, what does it mean to age into legacy? What does it mean to sort of be seen as Saturnian, particularly if Saturn's very closely conjunct your midheaven? What does it mean to sort of embody the wisdom and the responsibility, even if sometimes you don't always want it, right? Sometimes it's not a crown that you exactly want to have, but you're wearing it regardless. That sometimes is other people's perceptions of you. Saturn in the 11th. This is a great Saturn. It's all about like ally supporters, particularly if you were born during the day. It's like, oftentimes folks, you have a lot of like friends or community that is older and like people that are like building you up. It also can be like slow and steady in building relationships. Um, the example I have for this one highlights the celebrity challenge of Saturn in the 11th, which is fans. And this is actually Pamela Anderson. Um, she is a Gemini rising, Cancer, Sun, Aries, Moon. So she's a night chart, right? And she has, she also has her midheaven in Aquarius. So like Saturn both is about her public reputation, right? She comes up during Baywatch and she's sort of known for her sex appeal, right? You think about the red ones piece, the jogging, the blonde hair. But it's during her Saturn return, right? As she's married to Tommy, whatever his name is.
Tommy Lee Jones.
Thank you. Right? That she has the sex tape scandal, where is really a private tape kept at home, was always meant to be a private thing, gets stolen and then distributed online. And there's this whole sort of public outcry, but there's also this sort of shaming of her. It's a major public backlash. And that can also be like Saturn forcing, like, right, Saturn sort of bringing you down. It's a difficult Saturn, right? And there's sort of the limitations around support. There's limitations around fans. And for her, there's a reputational impact because the midheaven is right is ruled by Saturn. And so that Saturn activation, because this happened as Saturn was returning to Aries for her, that this sort of story comes out. So that's fascinating to me. I mean, like, what was this hyperlink? Sometimes I do things and I'm like, I don't remember this. So I think this is when she gets I think this is the day that the theft happens. I'm going to triple check myself. It's interesting because what happens is I think this is the date the video is published online. So the video is stolen 2 years before in 1995. So the video is stolen when Saturn is in Pisces. But the reputational issues, right, happens once this tape goes live. And I think that's what's really fascinating is that, right, the Saturn activation highlights the tape's release, not the thing being stolen, like the timing of the theft, which is very, very fascinating. So oftentimes we see like the Saturn issues might be a specific experience or a specific moment in time when your Saturn is particularly activated, like a Saturn return for Pamela Anderson. Doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that it's fair. It's just unfortunately how it showed up for her.
Think about like, I mean, the public just ate her alive, but then she did kind of flip it around and basically like used her sexuality to get back in the spotlight. Then she kind of changed her whole thing and is now seems very happy, which is nice.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that sort of as Saturn has returned to Aries again, right, the second time around, she's got a much different reputation and a much different way of wielding her reputation, which I think also highlights how Saturn transits tend to be easier for you as you age, right? Second Saturn returns tend to be much more mild, much more reflective, and in some ways can be owning the narrative in a way that it isn't always during the first time around. Let me just, before we go into the final house, if you have Saturn in the 11th, I think the thing is like, how do you give yourself time to build relationships? What does enduring support look like for you, or how do you think about that? And like, who are maybe the elders, the wise people that you surround yourself with, and or maybe can be grounding folks in your life that you don't necessarily find through like traditional home or traditional family, but like the people that'll give you the structure and the stability to support you versus hindering you.
As someone with an 11th house Saturn and you say structure and stability, I'm like, yeah, I'm wrecked without structure and stability. Like wrecked. But I have a terrible time making my own.
Yeah, and it's okay to like ask for help on that.
Gotta ask for help. It's important.
Yeah, we've all got it somewhere. Um, the last house, very fascinating. This is the 12th house. Saturn loves, rejoices in the 12th. It's not always a good thing, but it's a lot about the need for retreat, isolation. It's often the place of like our undoing. We see hidden enemies here. We also see like isolation in the sense of islands or places of retreat, like, and that can be things that we want, right? Like an ashram or a getaway, but it can also be forced, like incarceration. Now, I think the first person I want to talk about is kind of dark. I think I've talked about him before, is Michael J. Fox. Uh, Once again, he is Aquarius rising. Show that chart. He's an Aquarius rising, Gemini sun, Aries moon. Saturn rules his first house of self, and it's in Capricorn in the 12th. And during his first Saturn return is when he started to notice symptoms of Parkinson's. He had early onset. And so a lot of, right, his struggle has been like dealing with this diagnosis and like dealing with this illness, this thing that is forcing sometimes isolation, forcing retreat, forcing him to rest because of physical limitations, because it rules also his first house of the body and the self. He also has a difficult Saturn because he is a night chart. And so Saturn's going to be more extreme in this case, particularly because it's in a house where it gets to handle topics it likes. Um, so just that's one way this can show up. Once again, not for everybody, but it's a pretty extreme version. The less extreme and I think more positive version of it is actually Kathy Bates. So she's a Virgo rising, Sun in Cancer, Moon in Pisces, and she has Saturn in the 12th in Leo. Now, it's interesting because one of her first characters that really kind of like is her breakout is do you remember the movie Misery?
It's exactly what I think of when I think of Kathy Bates. It's the first thing that comes to mind.
Right. Like, and that's the funny thing is like Saturn in Leo is often about like Leo is like shine, eminence, brightness. It can have a lot of that sort of visibility. But she plays a really dark character. If you don't know, she abducts this author, holds him captive, isolates him. Um, these very 12th house things is part of like her work, right? So once again, we see sort of the 12th house playing out, but in sort of a metaphorical and artistic way, which can be a very healthy way to express it. And I think what's interesting is like there's a quote that I pulled. It's her perceived lack of conventional beauty has allowed her to take on unconventional, interesting roles from the very beginning of her career. Right. And so part of that, I think, is Uranus so tightly conjunct her midheaven, sort of the unconventional, the different, the interesting that she's able to pull. Um, but Saturn as well, I think, is from a like leaning into what makes her different rather than trying to look like everybody else. Um,
She's memorable, and that's.
she's so good in fried green tomatoes.
Yeah.
Um,
Talk about things that make me cry. Watch it out. No, don't.
yeah, she's so good in that movie. And so I think if you have Saturn in the 12th, it doesn't, I'm not trying to scare you. There's lots of ways to work with it that are not super dark, but like, how does rest or isolation help you? What is something where is that like a supportive thing in your life? Right. And also, you know, how is it that you can like portray the difficulty, the restraint, the isolation, maybe in a therapeutic way? Is it your art? Is it like a metaphor? Is it stories, right? Are there ways to kind of give that restraint life without it having to be something that like weighs you down? And it also might be that you might be a person that also just really loves being in isolation. This is a little bit different, depending on if you have a lot of stuff in the 12th. A little off topic because it's not Saturn in the 12th, but um, this is Thomas Merton, who was a monk, very famous monk. He wrote Seven Story Mountain, which is a lot about his time as being a particular kind of Catholic monk. And right, it's all about living in isolation and retreat. And like he is a 12th house stellium. I mean, that is Mars, the Sun, Uranus, Mercury, the North Node, and Jupiter. Um, Saturn is in the fourth, so it's him living in isolation. But I think it doesn't always, 12th house topics doesn't always have to be a bad thing. It can be something that you can enjoy or find meaningful. And so it's also okay if you find it really beautiful and meaningful to get away from folks or to want to be in places of isolation, or you find strength and stability by taking time away. It's another positive way to look at it. Saturn's got you quiet today.
Yeah, I don't even know. I don't know. I have no comment. That's
That's
why I'm
fine.
like, I don't know what to say there. I don't know what to
That's
say.
all good. Yeah. I mean, I think if there's anything that you take away from it, like Saturn, yeah, it can be difficult. It can mean really challenging times in our life. But Saturn can also be about the things that take time and are worth taking time for. And I think if we have that intention with it, if we have that understanding of it, there can be positive framings, but you have to have patience. And I think you have to also be willing to deal with delays. And if you can handle that, it gets a lot easier. I don't know that it ever gets easy, but I truly believe that working with Saturn can be transformational to have long-term, whatever you want to build long-term,
I don't
whether
think
that's your
anything's
natal
ever
Saturn
easy.
or Saturn transits.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think anything's ever easy, so,
Few things worthwhile
yeah.
are. So that's what we got on Saturn. We'll be back. We're talking about a couple of things. It might be a planet. It might be some more research. We'll let you know. You'll see. You'll see when we see.
We'll figure it out when we figure it out, and then we'll let you know.
But yeah, until then, be kind to yourself, and we'll see you on the internet.
Bye.